The US water infrastructure has an investment problem. Every 4 years, the US EPA surveys the country's drinking water infrastructure and writes a report to Congress that's supposed to inform the allocation of funds to public water systems to, in the end, protect public health. The first report came out in 1995, and as the seventh was written in 2021, if you do quick maths, you'll get that there will be a new report next year in 2025. But what do those reports say? Well, in a nutshell, exactly what I stated 15 seconds ago. The US water infrastructure has an investment problem.
Yeah, you already said that.
In the 1995 first edition, the 20-year investment need was estimated to reach a sizable $292.9 billion. Since then, and as you see in this table, it's not really evolved in the right direction. The need went up report after report until doubling to reach $625 billion by 2021. It would be over the top to affirm that nothing happened between 1995 and 2021, but one would agree with me that when the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund only dispersed $44.7 billion since 1997, it's a far stretch to the $625 billion need we just noted from EPA's report. So you see, when the bipartisan infrastructure law promised to put an unprecedented amount of money on the table, in a mix of grants and loans, yes, it's marked a historic inflection in investment patterns, but with just a little bit more than 50 billion fresh dollars on the table, it was at best a down payment. Zooming out from just drinking water to look at the entire water infrastructure, so including sewer, stormwater and wastewater to get you a sense of magnitude of what's at play here, in 2019 alone, US water suppliers spent $48 billion on new pieces of infrastructure, while the needs still for that year alone were estimated at $129 billion. That's a $81 billion imbalance, or roughly said, a 3-to-1 ratio between what should and what could be poured in the ground. And that imbalance seems to be here to stay, as the American Society of Civil Engineers estimates that it will further grow until achieving a $136 billion yearly deficit in 15 years. It's big numbers, we might be missing the point, so let me put a name on what's at play here. We're borrowing from future generations. We are taking a loan that none of them is of age to comprehend, accept, and guarantee. And by the end of the next decade, the cumulative debt that we will have piled up if we don't do anything is estimated at $2 trillion. Again, to be clear, that's a 2 followed by 12 zeros. A baby born in the middle of the next decade in the US will start life with a $6,000 water debt, and that might show in the quality of the water used to make his baby bottle. Last nail in that coffin, the ASCE also grades the current infrastructure. As of today, it gives a C- to drinking water lines, a D+ to wastewater infrastructure, and a D to both dams and stormwater systems. If we follow the great analogy, that means all water lifelines are just on the verge of not graduating anymore, and the system hence might crumble.
So, what should we do now?
Now, I can bark at that tree for a while, but will it change anything? We'll discuss that with May Stevens in just a minute, because she's for sure much more influential than me when it comes to impacting US policies. But before that, and to enlarge the context of that upcoming discussion, here's another way to look at the EPA Water Infrastructure Needs Report. As you know, if it's not your first time here, the US water sector is very fragmented, and he's not alone in that case. The pattern reproduces all around the globe, from Germany to Brazil, through Mexico or Switzerland. In the US, though, 85% of all water utilities have 3 or fewer employees. 80% of the drinking water utilities serve less than 500 people each, and 92% of them serve less than 10,000 people. Yet, all of those still have the exact same regulatory requirements as DC Water or Denver Water, and that's where the investment need report gets revealing. The report establishes 3 categories: the systems that serve more than 100,000 people, the large ones, the ones that serve 3.3 to 100,000 people, the medium ones, and those that serve less than 3,300 people, the small ones. To put it bluntly, the larger the system, the lower the investment needs. A large system will need slightly less than $1,700 per connected user, while a medium one will need almost $2,000 and a small one over $4,200. So as much as there is no good pupil overall, still continuing the metaphor, This staggering majority of small systems are even more dire than their larger peers.
Well, thanks for the news.
But before I lose you all to doom and gloom, there's also hope in those EPA reports. Namely, the EPA copies the findings of the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which highlights that for each additional dollar of revenue in the water and sewer industry, the increase in revenue across all industries is $2.62 in that same year. Meanwhile, one job in water and sewer creates 3.68 jobs in the national economy. So as already Rodzinek from the Columbia Water Center will tell us in a minute,
you do water right, and I really do believe that the rest will follow.
So yes, the US water infrastructure has an investment problem. But at a 2.62 to 1 return on investment, it can also attract capital beyond public funds. And at a 3.68 to 1 rate of job creation, it rapidly becomes an attractive employment policy move. As you see, this year again, there is a lot to rethink in water, especially if we want the 8th EPA report expected next year to finally show a change in trend. And sometimes that rethinking takes more than a gentle nudge, which I propose you to discover with May Stevens. You're the only water lobbyist.
I'm not the only water lobbyist. There's probably like 50 water lobbyists in DC, and that sort of includes the trade associations and the folks that are like sort of in-house at Veolia or Asylum, right? And then also the environmental organizations that work on water infrastructure. Sometimes those people don't all get along, and but combined, all of them, it's like maybe 50 people that are working on water in Washington. And you compare that to like thousands and thousands of people who are lobbying for like energy or defense or transportation, right? Like any of these other issues that get a lot more funding than the water sector. And then you could very clearly see why, right? It's because members of Congress, water is not as, top of mind as, these other issues, because there's so many people talking about all these other issues. And there's just not enough of us in Washington, even if we were working, 18-hour days, like 24 hours, 7 days a week, right? If we're doing all of those things, like there's still not enough of us. In order to get more power in Washington, we really need to have more people.
What are you specifically lobbying for?
I have a lot of different clients. So everybody from large utilities like WSSC, Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission in Montgomery and Prince George's County, Maryland, and DC Water in Washington, DC, to nonprofit Rural Community Assistance Partnership. They provide technical assistance to rural communities on lots of stuff, water infrastructure included, but also housing, economic development, all sorts of really important things and all sorts of interrelated things. I've worked with U.S. Water Alliance. I've worked with Brita. Everybody's got a Brita filter in their home, right? Working on all sorts of different things for all sorts of different clients. But one of the things that I would say that all of my clients really agree on is the need for increased funding in the sector, because that would solve a lot of the problems that we have, whether that's, addressing PFAS or getting rid of lead service lines or dealing with the effects of climate change or sort of combined sewer overflow consent decree. It's sort of been around for a while. The reason why it's been around for a while is because we just don't have enough money to fix it, right? It just takes a long time and a lot of money to fix some of these problems. If there was more federal investment in water infrastructure, then sort of all of my clients would be happier, because then they would have more to put into these, water systems.
Let me be a contrarian for a second. If we want to eliminate PFAS at the rate we're adding them to the environment, it would cost more than the world's GDP.
Sure.
How do we do it?
I am no scientist, but I don't know that we need to eliminate all PFAS everywhere. The water utilities are just getting it out of water, and then we leave it to TSCA to regulate the companies that are putting the PFAS into the products in the first place, and we leave it to like RCRA to get it out of like the ground. I am no scientist, so you would know better than I would about how expensive it is to eliminate all of it.
My question is, how do you set the bar as to what's realistic in terms of what can be affordable and what not?
When EPA sets a standard for any contaminant in drinking water, the Safe Drinking Water Act specifically details how to balance the costs versus the benefits. The benefits in terms of people not getting cancer from PFAS, or lead is a neurotoxin, so the effects of lead, whatever it is, they balance those against the costs of getting, more out. There's already a cost-benefit analysis built into the regulation.
The US EPA is making a study of the water infrastructure in the US, which they update regularly, and I think they started in the 80s. When they started in the 80s, about 3% of the water infrastructure was classified as bad quality or life elapsed. In the latest study they published, 33% of the water infrastructure is in very poor quality or lifetime elapsed. They also put a number next to that, which is how much would you need to invest?
Okay.
And I think by the latest updates, and now it's straight from the top of my head, it's something about 600 billion, which would be needed in terms of investment just to bring back the infrastructure to the level it was in the 80s.
Yes.
How do you close the funding gap?
What happened with funding for water infrastructure between the 80s and now is really indicative of exactly what you're talking about. In the late 70s, the federal government was investing about 60% of all of the investment in water infrastructure coming from the federal government. That was in the form of grants. In the early 80s, we changed that from grants to loans. And in that time, the amount of funding that has gone from the federal government invested into water infrastructure has gone from 60% in the late 70s down to less than 5% today. So we are dealing with a 40-some year backlog of a lack of investment, just a massive decline in investment. So that's why we have this big backlog of $600 billion on the drinking water side. I think it's about a little over $1 trillion total combined for drinking water and wastewater. This is the problem. It's 40 years of a lack of investment. And if we didn't do that, then we wouldn't be in the situation we are today. But now that we're in this situation, it would be helpful to think about other ways of funding water instead, right? To get us out of this hole. We don't have to do the same thing that we did before. We can think about other ways to fund it.
Which brings us to distributed treatments. I mean, 75% of the costs of the water infrastructure is the infrastructure itself. So the pipes taking water from left to right, not the production of the water, not the distribution on the last mile. So if you were able to bring the production next to the distribution, well, you can do theoretically 4 times more with the same amount of money.
You know these numbers better than I do. So,
so now if I want you to lobby for that.
I mean, that's great. If there are folks that want to push legislation that would incentivize a distributed generation of water, right? Like the same that we have at solar, right? And rooftop solar is the same thing. If we wanted to do that on the water side, like, sure, that sounds like a great idea. Like, have them call me. I'm happy to chat and see if it makes sense.
And that's probably the challenge, because who would call you? The sector is so scattered that whether you get 20,000 phone calls or you get 0 because no one thinks, oh, I can afford to have someone lobby for me in Washington.
If you're one person with one idea and you want to get that bill to become a law, you got to do more than just like talk to yourself. You got to have like other utility friends and the enviros. And if we're talking about like the rural communities, like let's get them involved. The governors would love this idea, right? Like go out and find supporters and build a coalition. That is how you build political power in Washington. And you don't have to call me. Like you can just lobby yourself, right? Like, lobbying is First Amendment protected right. It's your constitutional right to petition your government. You can just go and do that. But you can't just be one person because we have 400 million people in the US. And like, so one person is just one person. You got to band together and get other like-minded people involved.
From all the topics you're addressing right now, so all the pile you have on your desk, what's top one?
For me personally, I think that a low-income assistance program, a nationwide, permanent, fully funded low-income assistance program in the US would absolutely change the entire water sector. If every water utility got paid on time in full every month for every single customer, people would not have their water shut off. People would not be struggling to make ends meet, right? Because they would just be taken care of. And water utilities are just, by and large, the Department of Public Works in the city. They would be able to get all the funding that they need to actually make sure that the water system is fully funded and they're able to do all the things they need to do to keep the water safe. If you are able to do that, right, you have this sort of safety net for water utilities and for humans across the country, then that would make it so that we could do a lot of other things. If one community has a whole bunch of low-income people and a whole bunch of lead service lines, they'd use that money to eliminate people's bills and then use the money to replace lead service lines. Whereas if another community has a lot of PFAS in their water and they need to get a new filter system and an RO system to get the PFAS out, they can do that. That would really revolutionize the way that we think of water in the US because it would be fully funded. Whereas right now, the way that it's funded is we have to go every year to beg Congress for funding. They give funding to the states and then the states loan out that money, which is great if you're a utility or a community that can afford the loan. It's really good loan terms. But if you are a community that cannot afford that loan, there's not really any other options for you. There's some money at USDA, but like it's really for very small communities and it's not as much money as EPA is giving out and that is going through these infrastructure banks. And so the infrastructure banks are doing a really good job and they're doing a very important service in the country, but it's not reaching everybody because not every city can afford a loan. Sometimes they just need a grant. And so this would be a low-income assistance program would be a grant directly to the utilities to help sort of forgive some of the people's water bills, right? And so they would be taken care of, and then the utility could take that grant money and use it for whatever they need to use it for. It'd be huge. Yeah.
2 years ago, at that exact same spot, I had a conversation with George McGraw from Dig Deep.
Oh, yeah.
I read their report. I discovered that 2 million people in the US don't have access to water.
Yes.
And that puzzled me. It's the wealthiest country in the world.
Right.
If you don't have full access here, you will never get full access anywhere. So how do you bridge that gap?
George
how can
is
policy jump in to bridge that gap, to be more specific?
Yes, exactly. So what George is looking at is the people who don't have any connection to water at all. The low-income assistance program would be for people who have connection to water, a water system, but they just can't pay their bills. So two different problems and two very important problems. I absolutely think that we need to provide water to everyone, including the 2 million people that don't have any access at all. And so the way that you would do that is more funding, right? Like you need to be able to go out and help people drill wells, make sure that they're not contaminated. A lot of the 2 million people are in very remote areas, either they're Navajo Nation or in Appalachia, in the mountains, right? They're not going to be easily connected to a centralized water system, because if they could be, then it'd be easier to do it. If people are in very remote areas, then we need to go to them, right? And so this great idea of distributed water, like that sounds great. We could do it in those places, but it takes money. That's the real problem. If the people that weren't connected to water at all, right? If these 2 million people were all billionaires, they'd all have water. The problem is that they don't have money to get the water, so we need to just give them the money. Like we need to figure out a way of funding this. We can do it in a creative way, but like we need to figure out more money for the sector. That's the bottom line.
Now, more money, wherever it might be coming from, would for sure help the sector bridge the gap. But money doesn't plan, build, operate, or maintain infrastructure. People do. And there as well, there might be a policy step in to think of. We should discuss attractivity to the water sector.
Yes.
What's your take on that?
Making the water sector attractive for people to come and work, especially in the policy side, I think is a huge problem. Just the sheer number of people that work in our industry versus any other industry, you can see very quickly that we absolutely need to have more people working in the sector, in Washington specifically. But I also think, we're reaching a sort of gray tsunami is the sort of term that people use. Just a lot of people reaching retirement age and not a lot of people that have, sort of joined the water sector over the last several decades. So we really need to do more to incentivize people to come and work in the water sector. There are some very good ways of doing it. One of the pieces of legislation that I helped pass when I was a staffer for a member of Congress is a water workforce development grant program at the EPA, which has utilities partnering with local education organizations like local community college or trade school to do apprenticeships that would then get people into the water sector and get them on the sort of track into the water space. Now that's at the utility level, and we certainly need those folks too. We need to have a lot more ideas and a lot more, frankly, funding again to make that happen, right? The Water Workforce Development Program is authorized, I believe, at $15 million a year, and it's only appropriated at $5 million a year. For the folks out there who are not super policy wonks in DC, the authorization is how much Congress is allowed to spend, but then they actually only spend the appropriated amount. So they only spend $5 million, but they could be spending $15 million. They're allowed to be spending that much. They just are not. So we need more money, again, because this is a good program. And frankly, we could use a lot more than $15 million as well for apprenticeship programs like this, but we really need to develop it. But another great idea is to have philanthropy come and fill in that gap, right? Because there are a lot of philanthropic organizations who are not necessarily interested in water per se, but they are interested in workforce development issues just generally, right? This is one industry where they could plug in and really make a huge difference, not just to the people that are in the apprenticeship program, but the whole community. Because if you are served by a water system that has a lot of vacancies, there's like not enough people working there, then your water isn't maybe going to be as good because there's all these people who need to be doing their jobs that like those jobs are not filled. So it wouldn't be a bad idea to get philanthropy to join. It also wouldn't be a bad idea for private investment to come in as well, because why not? These are all places where a private investor could make money off of this for sure. So there'd be an incentive there, but we need to attract more capital to the space. It doesn't have to be all federal funding, but it certainly wouldn't hurt.
Would it need a crisis? I'm thinking Flint was a terrible event, but it also was a chance. It sounds weird to say that, in the sense that it triggered the regulation on the lead line inventory and then ultimately replacement. Maybe it needs to see a utility severely crashing because there's nobody on the steering wheel because they're understaffed, for people to realize that there's a big problem. We should address it, and it's totally addressable.
You bring up a good point. I actually wrote the legislation that addressed the Flint crisis, so I'm glad you bring up Flint. It was the first sort of time where water infrastructure rose in the consciousness of people outside of Washington, and really, in a real way, people outside of the water sector really started to understand that our water infrastructure is precious and we need to pay attention to it. We can't just not pay attention to it because bad things can happen. But what I would also say is that was a crisis and it led to a big change, right? We created a whole bunch of grant programs that helped not just Flint, but the 2,000 cities all across the country that have elevated levels of lead in their water. Those programs formed the funnel that the funding went through for that came out of the bipartisan infrastructure law. The counterpoint to what you're saying is we don't necessarily need a crisis. We just need political will, right? The bipartisan infrastructure law was the largest ever investment in the history of the U.S., more than $50 billion in water infrastructure investment, specifically for these issues that we're talking about. It didn't take a crisis to do that. It just took political will of like people saying, we've got to invest in this. So what are we going to do? How are we going to make it happen? Pass with bipartisan votes, right? There's broad bipartisan support for water infrastructure specifically in Washington. We just need to make sure that we're all speaking with one voice. We're elevating the issues that, and the solutions that we all agree on and getting that, sort of across the finish line.
You're mentioning we should all be speaking with one voice, which I would totally subscribe to it.
Sure.
Let's take just this climate week as an example. You have this conference which deals with water, and then what else on the agenda deals with water? Almost nothing. It's not even in the big topics of the week. Water scarcity is nowhere to be found. Why does water sit on the sidelines of the climate question, which Jackson was a climate question? Floods, most of the floods, hurricanes, which are felt through water, are a climate question, but can be solved with water infrastructure.
Right.
So why do we have this weird feeling that those dots don't get connected?
I think it's because there's not enough people in the water space as compared to the climate space. If you think of the number of climate advocates, the number of people who work on climate change in the country and the world, it is a lot more people than people who work on water. That's the reason why we don't have as many events during Climate Week that are specifically about water. But also Climate Week, you're allowed to submit your own events and they don't turn you away. So we could just make an event and host it and submit it and get it on the website. Like there's no boundary to that. It's just that we didn't do it, right? Because there's just not enough people and not enough time. We need more people to be taking advantage of these great opportunities like Climate Week.
When I discussed that with Mina Guli, who's run all these marathons to raise awareness to water, her bottom line was that we miss a single motto. Like carbon as zero carbon. You stop someone on the street and say, what's the problem with climate? Oh, zero carbon. They will know that.
Yes.
Stop someone on the street and ask them, what's the problem with water? Do we have a problem with water? There's no awareness of that.
Yeah, or they say a whole bunch of different things, right? They have a whole list of like, it's too expensive, it's unreliable, it's, unsafe, depending on whatever the last article they read was, right?
And yet sewer floods kill people in New York, in Manhattan.
Yeah.
Which, again, wealthiest city in the world.
Sure.
Inside the wealthiest country in the world, but sewer floods kill people.
Yes.
As a foreign French guy looking at that from far away, it sounds crazy.
New York has a lot of competing problems, right? And there's only so many people to solve those problems. We have to make sure that our problems are elevated in the minds of the people who are making those decisions. If we are really concerned about crime or rats, or, Mayor Adams just had a big rat summit a couple days ago, right? There's a million things, clean energy, all of the different things that New York has to worry about. We just need to make sure that we're staying on the radar of the people, of the politicians that are making the decisions, right? So the same thing at the local level as we are at the national level is just we need to stay on the radar of the people who are making those decisions. So
if you had to make a tagline on the spot, it would be more people.
Yeah, I feel like that's it. More people. Yeah, more people, more funding. I think that's it.
More money, more people, a key message that will resonate well with my next guest for today, as you'll understand in a minute. But before that, when I got to grab Reese Tisdale, the president and CEO of BlueField Research, I couldn't resist but to ask him, let's do a BlueField on Tap segment. See what I did?
Oh, you're listening to other podcasts.
I'm a big fan of Dave McKinson. So you're at the Rethinking Water Conference. Mm-hmm. If you had to rethink the US water scene, where do you start? With the tech companies, with the utilities, end user type of persona, or with the regulator, administration persona?
It's definitely not the technology. I don't think technology is the issue. I think there's a lot of great technologies out there. I think the bigger challenge is really not the technology, maybe the business model and getting entry to the market, which would lead me to, I think, the last point where the utilities are the end users, is figuring out empowering them, whether it be financially or through some form. It could be public-private partnerships to deploy the technology itself. I mean, I think on the municipal side, that's really where the change needs to happen. And that could be through a number of different things. Consolidation, it could be through, most of the water utilities in the U.S. are pretty small. As American Water Works Association says, 85% of them have less than 3 employees. Well, when you have so few employees, you really can't make any strategic decisions. It's all tactical at that point. Can you even address the growing list of challenges, whether it be PFAS or lead in some cases, or just basic asset management of aging infrastructure?
Don't worry, I have recorded more than that with Reese, but that will be for a next time, because for now, I'd like to stay on the policy/end-user/municipal utility challenges Reese just teased us with my next guest, Mayor Melissa Logan, to unveil what mechanisms a 12,000 inhabitant city can leverage to rise out of the tactical moves zone and be strategic with its water infrastructure.
I am Mayor Melissa Logan. I am the mayor of Blytheville, Arkansas. It's a little northeast Arkansas city that sits right on the Mississippi River. I'm in New York City representing a coalition of mayors. I am representing MRCTI, which is a coalition of about 105 mayors along the mighty Mississippi River. And we know that the Mississippi River really sustains life for us there. And so no water, no life. I tell everybody that all the time. And so it is our job, even as mayors, to advocate for our industry, for our economic sustainability, and for the environmental concerns that we have about the Mississippi River.
Indeed, right now, the Mississippi River knows quite well what climate change implies, as it faces a 3-year and counting drought that limits water access for industrial players, affects water quality for fish and human users, and reduces the usability of the waterway as a transportation highway. Hence, Mayor Logan's message.
I'm excited to let everybody know, 1, we exist, 2, we're important. And what happens on the Mississippi affects the rest of the world, not just the state of Arkansas or the 10 states, but the entire world. We move about 700 million tons of product up and down the Mississippi River annually. If we can't move product, soybeans, corn, steel, then the world feels it. Prices, they go up.
Now, as a mayor, you can't mitigate climate change. We'll come back to that in a minute, but you can try to adapt. The changing patterns in the Mississippi River being here to stay, the MRCTI has kicked off nature-based solutions to accommodate the new normal.
We have been in partnership with Ducks Unlimited, MRCTI has, to deploy about 100,000 acres of marshland. And what this is designed to do, as it rains, we absorb, and as it dries, we release. This project with Ducks Unlimited has been picked up by a private sponsor. What we're trying to do is deploy these resources along the Mississippi so that we have survivability. It's all about survival, right? Sustaining the waterways that most of us call home.
If I bring you back to circle of influence, as a mayor, you can't change climate change. You can advocate, but you can't reverse climate change. So you need to find adaptation solutions, one of which is catching the rainwater and ensuring that you can hence keep using the Mississippi as a way to move goods. How did the project start? What is the starting point of that stormwater catchment?
MRCTI has been around for about 12 years. We've started deploying more resources in that we are showing up and we are being known. So we're introducing ourselves to the system. So we are a coalition of mayors. So what happens a lot of time is the small man doesn't get fed. So we had to come out. We have to network. And so Ducks Unlimited became very interested in who we are. Ducks Unlimited has a huge presence in Memphis, Tennessee. So much so that we have a Bass Pro Shop in our old pyramid there in Memphis, Tennessee. They took an interest in our issues. We were saying flooding, we were saying drought, and Ducks Unlimited said, hey, we can help. They actually joined in partnership with us about 3 years ago and said, listen, let's come up with a fail-safe system to help along the Mississippi River. And so for the past year, we've been devising this plan. And so in the next year or so, we'll be ready to deploy the plan just to see if that's our valuable options. We have to create green space.
I spoke with Eric Simmons 2 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
I had two of your colleagues as well last year on the microphone. When I spoke with Eric, the main topic was Jackson.
Yes.
Because it was just a hot issue, the pressing thing at the moment. When there's a major catastrophe, of course, the attention draws to that.
Absolutely.
But then when it comes back to normal, how do you keep everybody aware that there's a sense of urgency no matter what, because you still need to cater for the river? And
that's why it's important to have a coalition. We're only as strong as our weakest link. If water is a problem in one city, it's a problem in all of our cities. That's why it's so important for us to advocate for one another all the time. And so we have a reserve so that when one of us is down, the other cities can come together and bring that city back online. That's exactly what happened 2 years ago. MRCTI kind of took the lead and said, okay, Jackson needs our attention. Let's deploy resources to Jackson. And so I think it's just being a part of something bigger than yourself and not operating in a silo, and being able to join arms with your sisters and brothers along the river and say, hey, don't forget us, we're still here.
Usually, municipalities and systems your size have a challenge with the silver wave, talents leaving, and you have a hard time filling on the role in the water utilities, which is not the sexiest job in the world, and a funding gap pretty often. Is it something you still face? And if you do, how do you overcome those?
It is something that we still face. But we have a team, Colin Wellenkamp, Brant Thornton, who is in charge of our government, Jenny Went. And so these three individuals go to bat for us every day. And what they do is they seek funding sources. They try to mitigate the issue of not having funding by staying plugged in. Brant operates out of the DC office. So he's right there where the magic happens. And so we're able to send bills through. In my little area, I have a great relationship with my Senator Bozeman, my Congressman Rick Crawford. And so what I do is I don't negate the fact that I have that connection. And so I bug their offices all the time, say, hey, have you thought about this? We need help. Our river is at record lows. What are we going to do about it? They get the Army Corps of Engineers tends to get involved and then plug us to resources through the EPA. The EPA is concerned about what happens even in smaller cities. And so I think this just staying plugged in and looking for those resources. Coming to the Climate Week in New York City, it gives us exposure and we give our story. And so people hear our story. And if they're interested in it, that's what philanthropy is. They buy into things that they're concerned about. And so we have a lot of philanthropic efforts that come in to be our savior, if you will.
So philanthropic is one way. There's the Infrastructure Reduction Act. So sorry for my Frenchness here. I'm obviously mixing two things here, the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. I'm actually referring to the latter. How does that trickle down at your scale?
The IRA money comes from the federal government to the state, and then the states deploy it. And so MRCTI has become a partner with the 10 states that it represents. They have tried to deploy those resources regionally, like for a full organization. But what we run into a lot of times is they won't let us apply as a coalition. Each individual state has to apply. So they have to help us find resources to apply for those funds individually through our state.
As a mayor, if I had to give you a political advice, I would tell you, take your hands off of water. That doesn't get you elected. That's what I'm hearing all the time. If you do a new park, people will like it. If you do a new water treatment or you fix the sewer, who knows? I mean, it's the right thing to do. Kudos for doing it, but it doesn't get you popular. So why do you care?
I care because I drink the water. The Mississippi provides water, drinking water, to over 20 million people. And so I care because I bathe in the water. I care because I cook with the water. I care because clean water is very valuable to our lives. And you say it won't get you elected, but try not treating the water. It will get you put out of office really fast.
What I was getting with my devil's advocate question is, what's the level of awareness? If you stop people in the streets, would they know that there's some challenge with the river or the sewer needs to get fixed? Or
in my area, I think that we focus a lot on that critical infrastructure, especially where we are now in growth. We can't solicit or recruit industry if we can't support them in the water or sewer infrastructure department. So I always stress to our city, it's important to invite people to your house, but make sure your water is clean. It's a big deal where we're from because we have bought climate change, we've bought resilience, we've bought plastics pollution to the forefront. This is something that we haven't focused on for 100 years. And so now we're focusing on what happens for sustainable practices for our city. Water is very critical. Sewer is very critical. I just keep it in their face. I have have a adopt-a-block program going on right now. I am in the midst of tearing down dilapidated housing. And in the recent year, I think I've almost converted fully to radio read meters, where I don't have someone walking, lifting up and reading meters. With radio reading meters, digital readings. And I think it's offering a more sufficient system.
Climate Week is not so much about water, which is a pity, if you ask me.
Right.
There's not so much talks about water. So how do you bring across your water message during the week? How challenging is it?
It's very challenging. You have to be invited to sit at the right tables to talk about water, because you're right, it's not at the forefront of everyone's ideation right now. Right now, we're focusing on global warming. We're focusing on more things than just water. And so I bring it up. I talk about it. I smile through it. I take the painful risk to do the hard right thing by keeping it on the forefront of people's minds. Then doing the easy wrong things is just let everybody forget about it. You don't. You keep crying out. You keep saying water is important. And then eventually it becomes the conversation.
On the attractiveness topic, how do you ensure that people who just graduate out of university, when they have to pick between, I go change the word for Apple or I go work for my water utility, how do we ensure that the right talents go to that sector? And sub-question to that question, within the water sector, we don't tap into women. 83% of the workforce is male, which means we are simply leaving aside half of the talent pool. How do we solve that?
Exposure. More women in leadership should advocate for that role, right? And we should look for opportunities to mentor and to speak about it. Staying plugged into universities, staying plugged into environmental programs, and letting the women see other women. This afternoon at 2, I'm going to be talking about women in water, because it is critical to encourage our children to go into chemistry, to go into, biosciences, to go into environmental studies, so that when they come out, they can step into those major roles. Women in water.
Women in water and in major roles, staying plugged into universities. That makes me feel like an obvious transition to Aurélie Rodzinek, who's program coordinator at the Columbia Water Center, and whom I'll start by very unelegantly trigger with. The water industry is also the boys' club of the 50-plus white males.
You are talking to a tiny brown woman with a European name and a Middle Eastern look. Boy, don't I know it.
I've been the party pooper, let me be the positive guy a bit as well. The CEO of Veolia is a woman. Mm-hmm. The CEO of American Water is a woman. The CEO of Suez is a woman. Something might be happening if we enable it to happen. But still, 17% of women in water, that's less women working in water than they are women priests and women taxi drivers.
Ask yourself, how did these women get to water?
What I'm saying is that when you have such an imbalance,
yes,
it means we are not tapping in at least half of the talent pool, which by definition means we are missing out. So it's also part of how do you bring balance. Well, when you bring balance, you're going to bring talent.
I'm thinking about the World Water Forum in Bali. I'm thinking about Stockholm World Water Week. I'm thinking about all the UN sessions that I had. And you know what? The real revolution that we're trying to accomplish is bringing youth and gender, and also, if I may say so, indigenous perspective into water. We desperately need them.
Then, once we have everybody around the table and we're tapping into the full talent pool, we can raise awareness on water issues. Why is water often overlooked in major climate discussions? How do fragmented water policies affect local communities? What can we learn from crises like Flint and Jackson we already discussed today? Can increased awareness truly change water policies and practices?
I've come to learn, after having many water conversations, that every single one of us has his own water story, has his own perception and understanding of water. You might hear water and just think about some drinking water. Others, it would be floods and flash floods and this phenomena that push them outside of their home. I think the gaps lay in the very first level of just realizing that we need to have better awareness towards water issues. I receive often reactions that can be anywhere from complete infatuation with the complexity of the topic and the potential it offers to complete people are freaking out. They're scared when I start talking about water, because it can be a very overwhelming topic. You interviewed people that come from politics. I'm sure there were some engineers sitting in this chair today. Some were doing wastewater, some were doing water technologies. Water is kind of like a domino, right? One falls, everything else does. But often, because it is a very fragmented topic, we get to take a certain niche and champion for it. But we also forget to interact. So if I am designing right now a bill for water infrastructure, later on, a citizen living in a neighborhood would not at all be aware that me in the capital pushing for this water infrastructure that is supposed to improve the water quality and management for the entire city is actually going to lead to greater flooding in his neighborhood. And then I have robbed this person of his power. He didn't own this power because he was not aware of where the water is coming from, who is controlling it, yada, yada, yada. I think the second people become aware of water, they also realize, okay, water influences our food, our energy. This is like very basic need, just like in terms of primal survival. Without water and food and keeping ourselves warm, we don't exist, right?
You don't need to convince me on that, but we are at Climate Week, right?
Yes.
So Climate Week, you have this over-quoted sentence which says that if climate change is a shark, what is its teeth? Everybody agrees on that. If you go to any COP, they will say that. Yet, where is water on the agenda of the Climate Week?
You know what? I am so happy you asked me this question because I get emotional when it comes to water. Because for me, this is not just a job, okay? This is like real lives of people. I've seen what too much, not enough, or poor quality of water does to communities. And when I went into the Climate Week website, there was nature, there were ecosystem, agriculture, everything, and water was not on the agenda. It's very sad for me to say because I have also incredible partners working in the public, in the private sector towards water issues. But because water is complex and it's a very long and tedious battle, I think that it's kept deliberately hidden almost. It's almost like this taboo topic.
Wait, that is even worse than what I was thinking. I was thinking it was just forgotten. You're saying it's deliberately kept out.
100%. I can, as a researcher, I can fully and confidently say that in certain partnerships, especially when you have private corporations, transnational corporations who control about 20 to 25% of the virtual water trade through food trade. And they go in and they buy this water-rich land that they're overpumping it or they're not managing it with the communities around them, then they're actually hijacking this water resource. When the communities start to look down their wells and they see, oh, where is our water? Or why is our water being polluted? Then they start to do the activism. They start to really step into the awareness. They are forced into the awareness. And then they end up in these long discussions and compacts, especially in the West, you see that, where water rights are clashing with one another, where interest and land rights are clashing with one another, and where these large corporations with endless funds would send scientists and hydrologists that would use extremely complicated questions. And knowledge equals power, right? How do we have access to our water knowledge? That's why I'm trying to get scientists in the same room with policymakers and with activists and with engineers.
Again, how do you do that?
You try to take the very complex dry data, you connect to the human emotion, and you translate it to a simple result. Getting knowledgeable is one thing. Raising the awareness is another. Having those allies that do know the science and that can translate it, just to let the communities know, get them informed.
But isn't the issue that we didn't see the consequence yet?
Didn't we?
When Flint happened, you got lead regulations, but that's almost the outlier. Jackson happened and there was no new way to address stormwater management. I mean, we're sitting in New York. In the most optimistic scenario, climate change will raise the level of the water by 0.8 meter, which means a section of Manhattan becomes more of a beach than it is today.
Yeah.
Which you can address. There are ways to address nature-based solutions and stuff. I'm not speaking of climate change mitigation. I'm speaking of climate change adaptation. But you have to start with the awareness. And my fear is we're going to wait for people downtown Manhattan having their feet wet to say, oh, if only we knew.
Isn't that the key in all of this discussion? If only we knew. If we knew actually what's coming, would we be able to come together and stop it? I believe so. Call me crazy. But I think that we will be forced to act. Flint is not Jackson, it's completely different. But it's nothing we didn't know. I keep hearing, oh, New York has the best water in the US. No, they don't. It doesn't take too much of testing to see the level of heavy metals, lead, micro, nanoplastic. Don't even get me started on CSO overflow, combined sewage systems that are getting overflowed down in Brooklyn and Coney Island. Down there, they already see the issues with flooding and pollution and water quality. And it's the community community activists that really make the difference. You know, my job is to convert people into water. Unofficially, like, that's what I do. I literally argue the case, and it would look very different depending who I talk to. If I talk to businesses, it's a lot about the water risks. If you take, for example, Flint, General Motors had a few factories there. The loss can be calculated, in millions of dollars. That can be a pretty good incentive for businesses. It's not the incentive that I would tell the communities who are now being flooded. Water is maybe the only last catalyst that can create a magnitude of change through the entire industries. You do water right, and I really do believe that the rest will follow.
Now, before our next segment, I need to plead guilty. I've spent far too much time covering the various shades of the UN Water Conference's gray, but as already seriously dipped her toes in the topic, I couldn't resist. You mentioned your UN experience. You also mentioned how you've been at UN sessions. I'll take this week to speak about that topic last time, and then I'll leave it forever. There was this UN Water Conference now 19 months ago in New York. It's supposed to be like the biggest event ever since Mar del Plata 1977. It was, to me, the most useless, jargonish 3 days ever. The only single outcome of that conference was to hire a special envoy for water, which I would debate it's even useful at all, but okay, it's the only thing they
Hank
committed to.
is a friend, so I have my own opinions on that.
I guess he didn't accept the role.
He's very action-oriented because the urgency is definitely there.
Is this a yes? Maybe?
You know what? When I came into the UN, I was using a lot of their material, their reports, and then I actually went into the room. And I went into the informal consultation, those ones that take hours and they fight about every single word. And I've seen how it goes. And for me, the UN became, let us not be spoiled and ungrateful, because before the UN, it was 10 times harder to do what we do. So having some sort of framework, even if it's not perfect, it's not that long ago that we had nothing.
Where I'm heading is that if the idea box looks like a shredder, then maybe it's better to not have an idea box, because you don't believe that the idea box is going to take you somewhere. Just to give you the end of my leading question. Finally, last week or 2 weeks ago, they appointed that special envoy for water. So it took them 19 months to hire the special envoy, when by all the markers, achieving SDG 6 is late by 75%. Meaning we're progressing at a quarter of the speed we should if we want to achieve SDG 6. The message should be, now it's all hand on deck. We go out and we do it, instead of what it took 19 months to appoint a special envoy. Come on. And on the other hand, I was interviewing Gary White this year. Gary White and Matt Damon, by going out and creating water.org, have brought access to water to far more people than any single country. I'm not saying it's a competition. I'm just saying that until the UN conference, I had hope in the UN to solve it. Now I believe that all that time hoping for the UN to be the messenger was wasted time, which we could have spent doing something else.
I try to just be respectful towards where we are in terms of international platforms and partnerships. You're not gonna hear me defending them. The UN Water is an umbrella network that doesn't really have the teeth. My entire thesis was comparing the human rights to water versus marketization and economic approaches. And it might not come as a shocker that the human right to water has not proven a sufficient tool to resolve a man-made mismanagement issue. It is more of a theoretical framework, and I invite you to look at the UN the same way. You're talking about that event, and I was there. The room was packed. We had people sitting on the floor. To me, it was almost a spiritual experience. I had CEOs sitting at the bottom of the table. I never thought that conference is gonna resolve water issues. I just thought that conference would be the moment where we assess our network and we choose who we can work with and how.
I did a counter of the number of times that they said, what is that?
If I will hear the Human Rights of Declaration one more time in somebody's opening speech, I will lose my mind. I always say that. No, really, there's a reason why I'm here right now and not in the UN. There's a reason why I directly engage with students, with private companies, with academics, and with public sector to cultivate this connection. I believe in more action-oriented projects.
Which leads me to my personal outcome out of that, which has to do with the circle of influence.
Okay.
I have been mistaken to think that you can influence stuff which is outside of your reach. That was wrong from the get-go. And if, as a water professional, I take my daughter to a wastewater treatment plant and explain to her what it is, she will understand what it is, and hence she will cherish it probably not as much as I do, but she will understand it. And if we all do that, to say just what can we directly influence, and we do it, which is what you said about what you're doing today compared to working with the UN. And I don't get mad at the fact that I wrote an action commitment with ChatGPT and they accepted it.
Oof. Oof. Having the UN disillusion shattered was the best thing that happened to me as a water professional. I've always been good at conveying my passions. I'm very passionate about water. My partner in crime, the one who runs this conference, Dr. Lal, he's an engineer genius. He doesn't tell me how to market my water pitch, and I don't tell him how to do his engineer designs. This trust coming together and creating these intersectional projects is what actually yields action.
So as I'd support Aurélie's call to yield action, I guess it's time for me to thank the 4 guests that appeared this week. May Stevens, Reese Tisdale, Mayor Melissa Logan, and Aurélie Rodzinek. The links to follow up with them are in the description. And to suggest you the following action, if any of what you've heard today has been of interest to you, please take this episode and share it with a colleague, a friend, your boss, or your team. And I'll be back next week with some more coverage of the conference season collected at WEFTEC in New Orleans. Until then, you know the drill. Make sure to subscribe and see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Don't Waste Water. This podcast was brought to you by GF Piping Systems. Loved this episode? Head over to Apple Podcasts to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. See you next time.